On a quiet night in Montevideo, Uruguay, the prison walls seemed to hold their breath. Beyond the iron bars and concrete corridors, the city slept under a velvet sky scattered with distant stars. Somewhere in the shadows of the jail, a man known as the Cocaine King of Milan was preparing for one of the most daring disappearances in modern criminal history. His name was Rocco Morabito, a name that, for decades, sent ripples through law enforcement agencies across Europe and South America. In that still moment, as guards went about their nightly routines and the hum of the city drifted faintly through the air, Rocco vanished into the night. By morning, his cell stood empty, the bed neatly made, as though he had never been there at all. To understand why this escape shocked the world, you must first understand who Rocco was. His life was not just a tale of crime but of transformation, ambition, and relentless pursuit, both by him and of him. Born in Africa, a small town in the southern Italian region of Calabria, Rocco grew up in a world where poverty was a fact of life and the shadow of the Ndrangheta, Italy's most powerful and secretive criminal organization, hung over every street corner. For a boy with quick wits and restless ambition, the path to power was not through politics or business but through the underworld. Years later, Rocco would become one of the most influential brokers in the global cocaine trade, the man who connected South American cartels to the lucrative European market. He wasn't just another gangster, he was a coordinator, a businessman, a negotiator who operated with precision. His nickname, the Cocaine King of Milan, was earned not through brute violence but through logistics, the meticulous arrangement of shipments, payments, and alliances that made him indispensable to his network. But power has a cost, and for Rocco, that cost came in the form of constant surveillance, hidden enemies, and a life lived in whispers. Even at the height of his empire, when millions of dollars worth of cocaine moved through his network each month, he could never fully exhale. Authorities were always closing in, recording phone calls, following associates, and building a case that would one day bring his empire crashing down. And when that day came in the mid-1990s, Rocco did not wait to be taken quietly. In 1994, as Italian police prepared to arrest him, he disappeared without a trace. For years, his name appeared on most wanted lists, his face circulated in law enforcement bulletins, but no one could find him. It was as if the man had dissolved into thin air. Rumors swirled. Some claimed he had been killed, others said he was living in luxury somewhere in South America, still running his network. Decades passed before the world heard of him again. In 2017, after 23 years as a fugitive, authorities finally tracked him down in Uruguay. He was living a quiet life under a false identity, attending social events and even sending his daughter to a local school. The arrest made international headlines. The man who had eluded capture for over 2 decades had been caught at last. For investigators, it felt like the conclusion of a long, exhausting hunt. And yet, Rocco's story was not over. 2 years later, in 2019, he would escape again, this time from a high-security prison, by climbing through a hole in the roof and disappearing into the night with 3 other inmates. The audacity of this second escape only added to his legend. To law enforcement, he became a ghost, a reminder that even in an age of surveillance cameras, data tracking, and international cooperation, some men could still slip through the cracks. Tonight, as you listen to this story, imagine the silence of that prison the moment his absence was discovered, the footsteps of guards echoing through the halls, the realization spreading from one officer to the next that the most high-profile prisoner in Uruguay had simply walked away from their custody. Imagine the cold dawn light creeping through the bars as news of his escape reached police headquarters, then Interpol, then the world. This is not just a story about a criminal. It is about the forces that shaped him, the choices he made, and the extraordinary life he led. It is about ambition born in hardship, power earned in shadows, and the relentless game of cat and mouse that followed him across continents. Over the course of this journey, we will trace his path from the narrow streets of Africa to the bustling heart of Milan, from secret meetings with cartel emissaries to quiet nights in exile, and from 2 miraculous escapes to the final capture that brought him home to face justice. Settle in, breathe deeply, and let the story unfold slowly, like smoke curling in the air. Rocco's life is a story of rise and fall, of cunning and consequence, and of a man who spent most of his life just one step ahead of the world that wanted to catch him. And as we explore it together, you may find that his tale is not only about crime but also about fate, persistence, and the strange, magnetic pull of freedom, a pull that would lead Rocco Morabito to escape not once, but twice. Africa, Calabria, is a place where the land itself seems to carry memory, rugged mountains stretching toward the sky, olive groves whispering in the wind, and narrow dirt roads that wind like veins through the countryside. For centuries, this remote village was marked by hardship, its people living between the stubborn beauty of the land and the unforgiving reality of poverty. This was the world that welcomed Rocco Morabito into life, a world where every stone and shadow carried the weight of tradition, and where the Ndrangheta's silent influence seemed to be as natural as the air the villagers breathed. As a child, Rocco would have seen the dual faces of his town, on the surface, a close-knit community where everyone knew each other's names, where church bells rang faithfully every Sunday, and where families gathered around tables for simple meals of bread, cheese, and wine. But beneath that picture lay something darker. The Ndrangheta was not an outside force here, it was woven into the fabric of everyday life. It shaped who got jobs, who was protected, and who lived in fear. In Africa, young boys learned early that respect was everything, and loyalty was currency. Rocco's family was not wealthy, and like many others, they struggled to make ends meet. The harsh economic realities of Calabria meant that many families survived on subsistence farming or small trades, and the future seemed narrow for a boy born into such conditions. The most ambitious young men faced a difficult choice: leave for the north in search of work or remain and accept a life of scarcity. But there was a third path, the one offered by the Ndrangheta, whispered in alleyways and at the edges of village gatherings. This path promised money, power, and a way out of poverty, but at a cost. Even as a boy, Rocco was known for being sharp-eyed and quick with words. He was observant, often standing a little apart from the other children, taking in every detail of the world around him. There are stories of how he would mimic the local men of respect, imitating their gestures and tone, as if rehearsing for a life he somehow already sensed was waiting for him. Calabria in the 1970s and 80s was not an easy place to grow up, but it was a place where a clever, ambitious young man could learn lessons about power that no school could teach. There was also the shadow of violence. Even if young Rocco was never directly exposed to it, the rumors would have been inescapable, tales of vendettas settled in the dark, of disappearances that no one dared speak of men who commanded fear without ever raising their voices. These stories were warnings, but they were also lessons. They taught him who held real authority and what it meant to command it. By his teenage years, Rocco would have felt the restlessness that many boys in Africa felt. The village was small, its opportunities limited, and the lure of the wider world called to him. For some, this meant seeking honest work in factories in Turin or Milan, sending money back to their families. For Rocco, it meant something else, a determination not just to leave but to rise, to claim a place where he would never again be powerless or poor. This is where the first threads of his destiny began to weave together. The Ndrangheta had a long tradition of grooming the next generation, and someone with Rocco's intelligence and charm would not have gone unnoticed. Whether it was running errands, carrying messages, or helping to move smuggled goods, he likely began with small favors that tested his reliability. In Calabria, trust was everything, and once earned, it could open doors to an entirely different life. The poverty of Africa was more than economic, it was also a poverty of possibility. For young men like Rocco, crime did not feel like rebellion but like opportunity. It was a way to claim dignity in a world that seemed determined to deny it. And so, step by step, he began walking the path that would lead him far from the dusty roads of his hometown and into the glittering heart of Milan's underworld. But before that journey could begin, there was still the imprint of Africa to carry with him. The smells of wood smoke, the sound of goats in the hills, the ancient rhythm of life that had shaped generations, these things stayed in Rocco's memory. Perhaps, in later years, as he stood in the lavish apartments of Milan or in the quiet of his Uruguayan hideout, he thought of his beginnings. Perhaps they were both a source of pride and a reminder of how far he had traveled, and how far he had fallen. For the listener, this moment in the story is like standing at a crossroads with him. The boy from Africa could have chosen a different path, but the world he was born into made that choice complicated, perhaps even impossible. The Ndrangheta was not just an organization, it was a network of families, traditions, and obligations that could pull a young man into its orbit before he ever realized how deeply he had been drawn in. It is important to pause here, to picture Africa under the golden glow of an evening sun, to imagine the boy Rocco walking those narrow roads, dreaming of something greater. This is where his story truly begins, not with guns or money or power, but with hunger. Hunger for freedom, hunger for respect, hunger for a life bigger than the one he had been handed. That hunger would drive him forward, propelling him toward Milan, toward the drug trade, toward the title of Cocaine King. And yet, with every step he took toward that destiny, he also took a step deeper into a world where danger would become his constant companion. The lessons of Africa taught him that power came with risk, and that trust was as fragile as glass. These lessons would serve him well in the years to come, as allies became rivals, as police tightened their grip, and as Rocco learned that the price of the life he sought was higher than he could ever have imagined. The night sky over Africa is full of stars, the same stars that would later shine over Milan, over Montevideo, over the prison from which he would escape. In this way, Rocco's journey feels inevitable, as though guided by fate, or perhaps by his own unyielding will. From this quiet village, a story was set in motion, one that would stretch across continents, across decades, and leave behind a legend that still captures the imagination today. Leaving Africa was not just a physical journey for Rocco Morabito, it was a transformation. The boy who had grown up under Calabria's rugged hills stepped into a new world where opportunity and risk were intertwined. Milan was waiting for him, but before he reached the heights of power, there was a period of proving himself, of learning the rules of the underworld through action. This was the stage of his life when he committed his first crimes, testing the boundaries of what he could get away with, and discovering that the thrill of danger could be intoxicating. Picture the late 1970s and early 1980s in southern Italy. The economy was struggling, unemployment was high, and young men were being pushed toward desperate solutions. For Rocco, petty crime became the gateway. Smuggling cigarettes was one of the first steps, a low-level but profitable trade that linked the small ports of Calabria with buyers eager to avoid high taxes. It was here that Rocco learned discretion, timing, and trust. He would have been responsible for simple tasks at first, perhaps watching the docks, carrying packages, or alerting others if police were near. These early ventures gave him a taste of money that far exceeded what legitimate work could offer. He could buy better clothes, spend freely, and command respect from other young men in his neighborhood. This was addictive, and it gave him the confidence to take bigger risks. Soon, his activities expanded beyond smuggling. Car theft was common at the time, and organized groups would steal vehicles, modify them, and resell them on the black market. Rocco's sharp mind and ability to organize made him stand out. But it wasn't just his skill at crime that impressed those around him. It was his personality. Rocco was charming, charismatic, able to win people over with his calm confidence. In the world of organized crime, this quality was as valuable as muscle. It allowed him to build relationships with men higher up the chain, men who could open doors for him and invite him into more lucrative ventures. There were arrests, of course. The early years were full of risk, and Rocco was not untouchable yet. Police records show that he was apprehended more than once for minor crimes, but each time he managed to slip through the system, serving little to no jail time. These brushes with the law seemed to strengthen his resolve rather than scare him. Each time he walked free, it was a confirmation that he could outsmart the system. During this time, Rocco was also learning about the internal structure of the Ndrangheta. Unlike other criminal organizations, the Ndrangheta is based heavily on blood ties and rituals, making it one of the most closed and secretive groups in the world. To gain their trust was not easy, but Rocco had something valuable to offer: ambition. He was not satisfied with simply making enough money to live comfortably. He wanted to build something bigger, something that would make his name respected and feared. This ambition led him northward, to Milan. The city was a magnet for anyone seeking wealth in Italy during the 1980s. It was the financial and fashion capital, a place where fortunes were made and lost, where skyscrapers rose above the streets and nightlife pulsed with energy. For the Ndrangheta, Milan was fertile ground for drug distribution, money laundering, and influence building. And for Rocco, it was a place where he could transform from a small-town hustler into a major player. But before he could establish himself there, he needed to prove he could handle more serious operations. This is when cocaine began to enter the picture. The drug trade was expanding rapidly, with Colombian cartels seeking reliable routes into Europe. Southern Italy became one of the main gateways, and the Ndrangheta took control of much of the trafficking. Rocco's role shifted from small-time smuggler to facilitator, helping coordinate shipments and payments. These operations were dangerous. Cocaine shipments were worth millions, and a single mistake could lead to deadly consequences. But Rocco had a reputation for precision. He knew how to keep information compartmentalized, who to trust and who to avoid, and how to stay several steps ahead of both the police and rival gangs. He was becoming exactly the kind of man that Ndrangheta needed, someone who could bridge worlds, who could negotiate with South American suppliers, who could manage logistics without drawing unnecessary attention. In these years, Rocco was also building his personal image. He dressed well, carried himself with quiet authority, and cultivated the appearance of a legitimate businessman. This dual identity would serve him throughout his life. It allowed him to blend into high society while running operations behind the scenes. He was learning that invisibility could be more powerful than intimidation. Still, there was always danger. Rival factions competed for territory, and violence was never far away. Rocco had to navigate a world where one wrong move could mean being targeted for retribution. He learned to keep his circle small, to stay disciplined, and to trust his instincts. These lessons would later allow him to evade capture for decades, but for now, they were simply survival tools. Imagine him during this time, a young man in his 20s, walking the streets of Milan at night, neon lights reflecting on wet pavement, his mind racing with plans. He was no longer the boy from Africa dreaming of a bigger life. He was building that life, brick by brick, risk by risk. The path ahead was dangerous, but it was also thrilling, and Rocco seemed to thrive in the tension between danger and opportunity. By the end of this period, Rocco had become known within his circles as reliable, intelligent, and ambitious. He was ready to move beyond petty crime into something far more sophisticated. The foundations were laid, the connections established, and the city of Milan was about to witness the rise of one of its most notorious figures. His first crimes were not just steps into illegality, they were steps into identity. With each theft, each smuggling run, each deal, he was shaping himself into the man he would become. And soon, he would no longer just be a participant in the underworld. He would be one of the men shaping it. Milan was a different world from Africa. Where his hometown had been marked by dusty roads and ancient traditions, Milan pulsed with energy, a city of flashing lights, polished cars, and endless possibility. The 1980s were a golden era for the city. It was the beating heart of Italy's fashion industry, its financial hub, and a symbol of the country's post-war prosperity. The air buzzed with ambition. This was where young dreamers came to make their fortunes, and Rocco Morabito was no exception. Only his fortune would not be built in offices or stock exchanges. It would be built in the shadows. Rocco arrived in Milan with a determination that burned quietly but fiercely. He was still young, but he carried himself like someone older, someone who already understood power. At first, he blended in. He dressed sharply, kept a low profile, and made contacts carefully. It was here that his natural charisma became his greatest asset. He had a gift for conversation, for making people feel at ease, and for reading them, knowing who could be trusted, who could be useful, and who might be a danger. He started small, as he always did. Smuggling networks that had once moved cigarettes now moved something far more lucrative: cocaine. The drug was rapidly becoming the stimulant of choice for Milan's elite, businessmen, models, nightclub owners, and celebrities. The demand was enormous, and supply routes were forming like veins connecting South America to Europe. Rocco positioned himself exactly where he was needed most, as the middleman. This was not the role of a street dealer or even a neighborhood boss. Rocco was stepping into something larger, a position that required intelligence, diplomacy, and above all, discretion. He coordinated shipments, arranged payments, and negotiated with both suppliers and buyers. He learned to move product through shipping containers, hidden compartments in vehicles, and clever disguises that would fool customs inspectors. This was logistics at the highest level, and Rocco was brilliant at it. At the same time, he cultivated an image that was as important as the work itself. Milan was a city of appearances, and Rocco understood that if he looked like a successful businessman, few would question his presence in the circles of the wealthy. He began to frequent fashionable restaurants, attend exclusive parties, and surround himself with the trappings of success. His charm opened doors, and his money ensured they stayed open. But behind the glamour, there was constant calculation. Every meeting, every handshake, every new connection was weighed carefully. Trust was never given lightly. The Ndrangheta had taught him that information was power, and so he kept his network tight, sharing only what was necessary. This discipline kept him one step ahead of rivals and law enforcement. The 1980s drug market in Milan was thriving, and Rocco's role grew with it. He was no longer just an ambitious young man trying to prove himself, he was becoming a crucial figure in a vast operation that stretched from the jungles of Colombia to the nightclubs of northern Italy. Cocaine shipments moved through ports, across borders, and into the hands of distributors, generating profits so large they could be laundered into legitimate businesses, real estate, luxury goods, even respectable companies that gave the operation a facade of legality. And yet, despite his growing wealth, Rocco kept himself slightly apart. He enjoyed the luxuries his money could buy, fine suits, expensive cars, but he was never reckless. Others might flaunt their riches, drawing unwanted attention, but Rocco remained careful, even cautious. He understood that visibility was a liability. The most powerful man in the room was often the one who spoke the least, and Rocco learned to let his results speak for him. This period of his life marked his true ascent. He had left behind petty theft and small-time hustling. Now, he was a broker, the man who made deals happen, who could be trusted to deliver on promises worth millions. His reputation spread quietly but surely. Within the Ndrangheta, he was seen as reliable, intelligent, and valuable. He had earned his place. There were, of course, dangers. Milan was not without its rival factions. Other criminal groups, including remnants of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra and independent traffickers, wanted their share of the lucrative cocaine trade. Violence flared at times, assassinations, disappearances, sudden bursts of bloodshed that reminded everyone that the underworld was never a safe place. Rocco navigated these dangers with care, avoiding open conflict and choosing alliances that kept him protected. At night, the city seemed to mirror Rocco's double life. The streets glittered under the lights, but shadows lurked in every alleyway. It was in those shadows that the real deals were made, the real power decided. And Rocco was there, quietly pulling strings, connecting worlds that were never meant to touch. Imagine him during this time, standing on the balcony of a Milan apartment overlooking the glowing skyline, a glass of wine in his hand, his mind running through logistics, which shipment was due to arrive next week, which payment needed to be moved, which contact might be turning unreliable. Success brought satisfaction, but also sleepless nights. The higher he climbed, the more dangerous the fall would be. Still, there was a sense of inevitability about his rise. This was what he had been moving toward since his youth in Africa, a place of power, a place where he could no longer be dismissed as just another poor boy from Calabria. He had made himself indispensable, and for now, the rewards were flowing. What he could not know was that every shipment he arranged, every meeting he attended, every phone call he made was leaving a trail, one that patient investigators would one day follow. For now, though, Rocco was untouchable, the quiet architect of a network that stretched across continents. His rise in Milan was complete. The cocaine king of Milan was not a title given lightly, but Rocco had earned it. He had taken his place among the great brokers of Europe, and though danger was ever present, he seemed almost untouchable. The boy from Africa had become a man of power, and Milan was his stage. At the height of his career, Rocco Morabito had become more than just a man, he was a vital link in a chain that stretched across the Atlantic Ocean, connecting coca fields in South America to the glittering nightlife of Europe. The transformation was complete. The boy from Africa who once ran errands for cigarette smugglers was now orchestrating multi-million-dollar shipments of cocaine, operating with a level of sophistication that few could rival. These were the years that earned him his nickname, Il Re della Cocaina di Milano, the cocaine king of Milan, and it was during this period that his network reached its most impressive and dangerous scale. The mechanics of the operation were almost elegant in their complexity. Shipments were arranged through trusted contacts in Colombia and Brazil, often hidden deep inside cargo containers carrying seemingly legitimate goods. Some loads were concealed in shipments of coffee, fruit, or even machinery parts. Each container represented a gamble, a test of whether Rocco's planning could outwit customs officials and police dogs trained to sniff out narcotics. And most of the time, it worked. Rocco had mastered the art of compartmentalization. No single person knew every detail of an operation, so even if one link in the chain was broken, the rest remained intact. There were couriers, drivers, warehouse keepers, and accountants, each playing their part in a vast choreography that moved cocaine from ship to port, from port to safe houses, and from there into the hands of distributors who fed Milan's endless appetite for the white powder. What made Rocco truly exceptional was not just his ability to move product, but his ability to keep things calm. In a business known for its volatility, where a single betrayal could lead to bloodshed, Rocco cultivated an atmosphere of quiet professionalism. Disputes were handled with precision, payments were made on time, and partners were kept satisfied. This stability made him indispensable not only to the Ndrangheta but also to the South American cartels who valued a reliable European contact. Money poured in. The profits from even a single successful shipment were staggering, enough to buy luxury apartments, fast cars, and legitimate businesses that laundered the proceeds. Milan's economy, with its endless opportunities for investment, provided the perfect cover. Restaurants, bars, and real estate deals became both income streams and fronts for the operation. To outsiders, Rocco appeared to be just another wealthy entrepreneur enjoying the rewards of Italy's boom years. But behind the polished exterior, the tension was constant. Each new shipment brought with it the risk of discovery. One wrong move, one careless associate, and the entire network could collapse. Rocco lived in a world where trust had to be earned over and over again, where paranoia was not a weakness but a survival instinct. Phone calls were kept brief, meetings were arranged in discreet locations, and security was layered like an invisible shield around his life. Still, there must have been moments when he allowed himself to enjoy the fruits of his labor. Imagine Rocco in a Milan nightclub, the bass of the music pulsing through the floor, expensive champagne on the table, his tailored suit catching the light. Around him, models, actors, and businessmen laughed and celebrated, oblivious to the fact that the man in their midst was one of Europe's most important drug traffickers. To Rocco, these moments were more than pleasure, they were proof of how far he had come, evidence that he could stand among the elite of society and pass as one of them. The scale of his operations also meant that he was becoming more visible to law enforcement. Italian anti-mafia prosecutors were beginning to realize that the Ndrangheta was not just a regional threat but an international powerhouse controlling the European cocaine trade. Wiretaps were set up, shipments monitored, and suspects followed. Investigators knew that someone was coordinating the Milan market with remarkable efficiency, and slowly, they began to put a name to that someone, Rocco Morabito. For now, though, Rocco remained a step ahead. Each time a shipment was intercepted, he absorbed the loss and adjusted his methods. Each time a courier was arrested, he ensured that the damage was contained. It was a dangerous game of chess, and for years, he seemed to win every match. His legend grew, even within the criminal world. To be associated with Rocco was to be associated with success. He had become a brand, reliable, sophisticated, and almost mythic in his ability to evade disaster. Young men who dreamed of rising in the underworld looked to him as an example. He was proof that intelligence and strategy could elevate a man far above the street-level violence that consumed so many others. But this was also the period when the first cracks began to appear. The very success that made him powerful also made him a priority target. International cooperation between law enforcement agencies was increasing, and new technologies were making it harder to stay invisible. Wiretaps captured snippets of conversation, enough to hint at a vast operation that was bleeding cocaine into Europe at an unprecedented rate. Surveillance teams followed trucks, watched warehouses, noted faces. Slowly, a picture was forming, a picture that would one day be used to bring Rocco down. For the moment, however, Rocco was still at the top of his game. The cocaine highway was running smoothly, the money was flowing, and Milan was his kingdom. The man who once dreamed of escaping the poverty of Africa had not only escaped it, he had built an empire. Yet power, like a double-edged sword, cuts both ways. The higher Rocco climbed, the more dangerous his position became. The hunters were closing in, even if he couldn't see them yet. And somewhere in the shadows, the first threads of the net that would one day ensnare him were already being woven. Power changes a man. For Rocco Morabito, the years at the top were both exhilarating and suffocating. Milan was his playground, but it was also a stage on which he had to perform carefully, never breaking character. By day, he was the polished businessman, appearing at cafes, fashion events, and exclusive dinners, speaking softly, smiling at acquaintances. By night, he was the mastermind, moving pieces across a board that stretched from South America to southern Italy. The contrast was thrilling, but it also wore on him. There is a certain weight that comes with success in the underworld, a constant, invisible pressure that tightens with each deal, each shipment, each risk taken. Rocco felt that weight daily. He had achieved what few men ever could, a place of influence, respect, and wealth. But that position also painted a target on his back. Rivals watched him. Law enforcement stalked him. Even allies could not always be trusted. In the luxury apartments where he planned his operations, there were moments of quiet that must have felt almost unbearable. The city lights glittered outside the window, but inside, the air was heavy with caution. Rocco trusted very few people, and even with those, trust was measured, conditional, always under review. Meetings were arranged with care, locations changed at the last minute, and conversations often ended abruptly if there was even a hint of risk. Paranoia became a kind of companion, one he could not afford to ignore. A new car parked outside for too many nights might be a surveillance team. A familiar face in a restaurant might be an informant. Even phone calls, brief and coded as they were, had to be placed with caution. It was not unusual for Rocco to swap devices frequently, to meet associates in public places where he could see who was approaching from all sides. And yet, despite this carefulness, there was always an undercurrent of fear, not the kind that paralyzes, but the kind that sharpens instincts. Fear kept him alive. It made him notice small changes in routine, it pushed him to double-check every plan, and it reminded him that one mistake could bring everything down. The danger did not only come from police or rivals. Within the world of organized crime, betrayal was a constant threat. A single informant could unravel years of work. Rocco was known to be cautious with whom he allowed close to him. Loyalty was rewarded, but disloyalty was dealt with swiftly. This balance kept his network functioning, but it also meant that trust was never absolute. Every ally was also a potential weakness. Despite this, there must have been moments of calm, moments where Rocco allowed himself to enjoy what he had built. Perhaps he stood on a balcony in the warm night air, glass of whiskey in hand, the hum of the city below him, feeling for just a moment that he had mastered the game. But even in those moments, his mind would have been running, planning, anticipating, scanning the horizon for the next threat. This was the paradox of his life. He had everything he once dreamed of, yet he could never relax fully enough to enjoy it. The more successful he became, the more he had to lose. That reality settled over him like a second skin, shaping his every move. At social gatherings, he played his part with precision. He laughed when others laughed, spoke when it was safe to speak, and listened far more than he talked. The polished exterior hid a man who was always calculating. To most, he seemed calm, collected, even charming. Only a select few might have seen the tension in his eyes, the way he scanned the room, the way he positioned himself so that no one could approach unnoticed. These years were also marked by a growing awareness that he was being watched. Italian investigators were ramping up their efforts against the Ndrangheta, and surveillance operations were becoming more sophisticated. Wiretaps captured voices in code, meetings were photographed, and slowly, patiently, a case was being built. Rocco may not have known all the details, but he would have felt the pressure. There are moments when a man simply knows that the wind is shifting, that the danger is no longer distant but close. And so, paranoia became strategy. He changed his patterns, reduced the number of people who had access to him, and limited his exposure. He still moved shipments, still coordinated deals, but with an added layer of caution. He was not reckless, and he knew that survival meant staying invisible even as his legend grew. This constant tension was both a strength and a burden. It kept him alive, but it also kept him from peace. Rocco had built an empire, but it was an empire on shifting sand, one that required constant vigilance to keep from collapsing. The game was thrilling, but it was also exhausting, and somewhere deep down, Rocco must have known that no man could play it forever. Picture him driving through the streets of Milan late at night, the city quiet, the glow of streetlights flashing across the windshield. Perhaps he thought of Africa, of the boy he once was, and wondered if this was the life that boy had imagined. He had escaped poverty, but in its place he had found a new prison, one made of fear and expectation. In this way, Rocco's power became a double-edged sword. It gave him wealth and influence but also tethered him to a life of constant alertness. Every door he opened led to another that had to be guarded. Every success brought with it a new risk. This was the price of the life he had chosen, and for a time, he was willing to pay it. But no matter how careful he was, no matter how perfectly he managed his network, the forces gathering against him were relentless. Investigators had time on their side, and they were patient. The trap was being set, piece by piece, and soon, Rocco would find himself facing the first great test of his life, a test that would end not with a violent confrontation but with something far more dramatic, a disappearance that would leave everyone stunned. By the early 1990s, Rocco Morabito's name was no longer just whispered in criminal circles, it had become a priority for law enforcement. For years, investigators had been chasing shadows, following leads that seemed to evaporate just when they thought they were close. But now, piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. Italian prosecutors, anti-mafia units, and intelligence officers had spent countless hours on wiretaps, intercepting conversations, mapping out the network. They knew who some of his associates were, they knew the ports where shipments came in, and they knew that the man they called the cocaine king of Milan was at the center of it all. The noose was tightening, and Rocco could feel it. His instincts, honed by years of survival, told him something was shifting. Perhaps it was a face he didn't recognize lingering too long near one of his meeting spots, or the subtle questions being asked in places where people normally didn't talk. Perhaps it was the way one of his closest contacts seemed nervous, hesitant, as if they knew more than they were saying. Whatever it was, Rocco's sixth sense told him that the calm that had protected him for so long was about to break. Behind the scenes, investigators were working with precision. Their strategy was not to take down just one man, but to dismantle an entire network. They monitored phones around the clock, transcribed hours of coded language, and traced financial transactions. Slowly, they built a case that would stand in court, not just against Rocco, but against multiple players in the Milan cocaine pipeline. For Rocco, the walls were closing, and even if no one had yet knocked on his door, he became more cautious than ever. Meetings were moved to safer locations, communications became even more cryptic, and some operations were put on hold. But the truth was that the investigation had gathered too much momentum. The police were patient, and they were willing to wait until the moment was perfect, until they could catch him with undeniable evidence, leaving no room for escape through legal loopholes. In Milan, there was a tension in the air that only Rocco seemed to fully feel. He had lived for years with the constant hum of risk, but now that hum had turned into a steady drumbeat. The sense of being watched was no longer a vague paranoia but a near certainty. It was in the way unmarked cars seemed to pass too often on certain streets, the way phones occasionally clicked with a sound that made him pause, the way a few familiar faces disappeared from the scene altogether. Meanwhile, prosecutors prepared their final move. Arrest warrants were drafted, raids were planned with military precision, and teams were assembled for a coordinated sweep that would hit multiple locations at once. They wanted to catch Rocco by surprise, to take him alive, to prevent any chance of escape. What they underestimated was Rocco's ability to sense danger before it struck. Whether through an informant, a leak, or simply his own uncanny timing, he realized that the window of freedom was closing. And in that realization came the decision that would define him for years to come: he would not be captured. Imagine the final days before his disappearance. Rocco moving through the city with a quiet urgency, tying up loose ends, moving money, warning trusted associates. Perhaps he spent one last night in the apartment that had been his headquarters, looking out at the skyline that had once symbolized triumph, now knowing that it had become a cage. For investigators, the night of the raid was meant to be the culmination of years of work. They moved in before dawn, surrounding the locations where they believed Rocco and his associates would be. Doors were kicked open, arrests were made, suspects pulled from their beds. But when they reached the place where they expected to find Rocco, he was gone. No struggle, no signs of violence, just an empty space where a man had been hours earlier. The frustration among law enforcement was palpable. How had he known? How had he slipped through their fingers at the exact moment they were ready to strike? It was as if he had vanished into thin air. For Rocco, this was not luck but strategy. His first escape was not a dramatic chase through the streets but a quiet disappearance. He left behind his Milan life, the apartments, the cars, the trappings of wealth, and melted into the world's vastness. For years, no one would know where he had gone. Some said South America, others whispered of Africa. Rumors spread like wildfire, but there was no confirmation. The police had taken down part of his network, but the man at the center of it remained at large. To them, this was a bitter victory. They had prepared to bring down a king, but instead, they were left with a ghost. This moment marked a turning point in Rocco's life. From now on, he was not just a trafficker but a fugitive, a man whose very survival depended on staying one step ahead of those who wanted to capture him. The escape cemented his legend and made him a priority for Interpol, placing his name and face on wanted lists across the world. For the listener, this is where the tension begins to peak. The game of cat and mouse had truly begun, and Rocco had just made his first brilliant move, vanishing completely, leaving investigators with nothing but questions and a determination that would only grow stronger with time. The disappearance of Rocco Morabito in 1994 remains one of the most fascinating episodes in modern organized crime history, not because it was violent or chaotic, but because it was so quiet, so impossibly clean. There was no gunfight in the streets, no desperate car chase through the night. One day, Rocco was a man under investigation, the next, he was gone, leaving behind only questions, suspicions, and a trail that seemed to end in smoke. In the days leading up to his vanishing, the city of Milan was unknowingly holding its breath. Law enforcement was preparing its sweep, and prosecutors believed they finally had enough to put him behind bars for decades. But Rocco had been paying attention. He had always been careful, but now he became meticulous, moving like a man who knew that every second counted. Some believe he was tipped off, perhaps by a corrupt official, perhaps by someone in his network who caught wind of the investigation's final stage. Others think it was simply his instinct, the sharpened survival sense that had kept him alive this long. Whatever the truth, Rocco acted decisively. He liquidated assets, collected cash reserves, and quietly cut ties with anyone who might slow him down. He changed safehouses, altered his routines, and shed his old identity like a snake shedding its skin. Then, one night, without a sound, he slipped away from Milan. Where he went first is still debated. Some accounts suggest he traveled south, returning briefly to Calabria to hide among trusted allies before arranging his departure from Italy. Others say he moved directly across the border into Switzerland or France, using forged documents to stay ahead of anyone searching for him. What is certain is that he vanished so completely that when police launched their raids, they found nothing but empty rooms and cold trails. Imagine the investigators walking through his apartment, the silence hanging heavy, the closets cleared, the traces of his life erased. It must have felt like chasing a ghost. Years of surveillance, wiretaps, and patient preparation had led to this moment, and yet the man at the center of it all was simply gone. The media seized on the story, turning Rocco into a kind of myth. Headlines dubbed him the cocaine king who vanished and speculated wildly about where he might be. Some claimed he was living in luxury somewhere in South America, still running his empire from afar. Others believed he had retired entirely, enjoying the spoils of his fortune in some remote paradise. Every rumor added to the legend, and every sighting, whether in Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, or Barcelona, kept the story alive. For Rocco, this was a time of transformation. He could no longer live openly, no longer move freely through Milan's restaurants and nightclubs. He had become a fugitive, and that meant constructing a new life from the ground up. New names, new documents, new friends. To survive, he had to disappear not just physically but psychologically, to erase the man he had been and become someone entirely different. This required discipline, and Rocco had it. He kept his circle small, avoided unnecessary risks, and moved only when it was safe. For months, perhaps years, he stayed off the radar, never contacting those whose communications might be monitored, never leaving a trail that could lead back to him. It was a lonely existence, but one that kept him free. Interpol soon added him to their list of most wanted fugitives, and Italian authorities kept his file open. The case became a symbol of both frustration and determination, a reminder that even with all their resources, they had failed to catch the man they most wanted. For the Ndrangheta, his escape was both a complication and a point of pride. Some factions may have been angered by the disruption, while others saw it as proof of Rocco's cleverness and resilience. After all, to evade a full-scale police operation and simply melt into the world was no small feat. In the years that followed, Rocco's name would surface from time to time, usually as part of larger investigations into international cocaine trafficking. Prosecutors believed he was still active, still coordinating shipments from a distance, though evidence was scarce. His ability to stay hidden only made him more legendary. Imagine Rocco during those first months in hiding, perhaps in a small apartment in another country, the curtains drawn, the television muted, his ears attuned to every sound outside. He would have been cautious with every step, every purchase, every interaction. A single mistake, a careless use of an old contact, a phone call made from the wrong line, could have brought it all crashing down. And yet, he managed to stay ahead. His vanishing was not just a moment, but a process, a slow fading from the world he once dominated. Over time, he became a ghost, a name on a wanted list, a face on a poster that grew older as the years passed. For those who chased him, it must have been maddening. Each year that went by without a lead was a reminder of their failure. And yet they never stopped looking. The Italian state is patient, and justice moves slowly but deliberately. They knew that one day, perhaps years later, Rocco would make a mistake, and when he did, they would be ready. For now, though, Rocco was free. The great vanishing had succeeded, and he had bought himself not just months or years, but decades. In Montevideo, where he would eventually resurface, no one knew the name Rocco Morabito. He was just another foreigner, another man starting over. The cocaine king of Milan had become invisible, and in that invisibility, he found both survival and the next chapter of his story. This first escape would define him for the rest of his life. It was proof that he could outthink the system, that he could vanish in plain sight and live to tell the tale. It also set the stage for everything that would come later, the years of exile, the quiet rebuilding of his life, and the second, even more audacious escape that would shock the world again decades later. For more than 2 decades after his vanishing, Rocco Morabito lived as a ghost. The Milan kingpin who had once commanded a vast cocaine network was now a man without a country, a fugitive who had mastered the art of invisibility. His journey eventually took him to Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay, a city that, at first glance, seemed far removed from the high-stakes world of European drug trafficking. Nestled between Brazil and Argentina, Montevideo was quiet, orderly, and almost sleepy compared to the bustling chaos of Milan. It was, perhaps, the perfect place for a man like Rocco to disappear. Under a false identity, Rocco began to construct a new life. He obtained forged documents that gave him a new name and a new backstory. To the neighbors who saw him each morning, he was just another well-dressed foreigner, polite and reserved, who lived in a comfortable home and kept mostly to himself. No one would have guessed that behind the unassuming exterior was one of Europe's most wanted men. Montevideo gave Rocco something he had not felt in years, the illusion of normalcy. He walked the city's leafy streets, shopped in local markets, and even attended social gatherings. Reports suggest he was seen at parties, mingling with diplomats and businessmen, his charm still intact. If anyone asked too many questions about his past, he had practiced answers ready, vague enough to satisfy curiosity but never revealing enough to draw suspicion. In this quiet life, Rocco appeared to have struck a delicate balance. He was no longer the highly visible broker of Milan, constantly orchestrating shipments and negotiating deals. Instead, he worked from the shadows, using trusted contacts and encrypted communication to stay connected to parts of the drug trade. It is believed that he remained involved at a high level, advising, coordinating, and profiting from shipments, though always keeping himself at a safe distance from direct operations. The house where he lived was elegant but not ostentatious, a 2-story property with a courtyard, surrounded by high walls and shaded by trees. It was the kind of place where privacy was easy to maintain. Inside, the rooms were reportedly tastefully furnished, with the understated luxury of someone who wanted comfort but not attention. For years, this house was his refuge, a place where he could finally sleep without the constant noise of Milan's nightlife or the immediate threat of arrest. And yet, even here, the old habits must have remained. Rocco was a man trained to look over his shoulder, to notice who was watching, to keep routines flexible so that no pattern could be exploited. If he sat in a cafe, he would likely choose a seat facing the door. If he drove, he would have been careful to notice if the same car followed him twice. Life as a fugitive meant that freedom was never absolute, there was always the possibility that one day, the past would catch up. Still, the years rolled on, and Rocco's confidence in his new identity grew. He raised a family during this time, sending his daughter to a local school, creating the picture of a man who had left his past behind. To his neighbors, he seemed cultured, well-mannered, even generous. The quiet charm that had served him so well in Milan now became a shield, keeping suspicion at bay. But while Montevideo gave him safety, it also gave him time to think. Far from the adrenaline-fueled operations of the 1980s and 90s, Rocco had space to reflect. Perhaps he thought of Africa, of the roads that had shaped him, of the boy he once was. Perhaps he thought of the nights in Milan when he had stood at the center of a criminal empire, feared and respected in equal measure. In the soft quiet of Uruguay's nights, he must have known that the world had changed while he had been hiding, new players rising in the drug trade, new technologies making secrecy more difficult, new investigators dedicated to finding him. And indeed, somewhere far away, his name never left the files of Italian prosecutors. His case was kept alive year after year, his face updated on Interpol's most wanted list, his name whispered whenever a major cocaine shipment was intercepted. For the authorities, he was unfinished business, a man whose capture would be both a victory and a symbol. It is a strange thing to live as both a man and a myth. Rocco was flesh and blood, walking the streets of Montevideo, shaking hands at parties, living what looked like an ordinary life. But elsewhere, in police stations and courtrooms, he was still a phantom, the man who got away, the man who had eluded justice for decades. That tension must have been both empowering and unnerving, reminding him that no matter how far he had traveled, the chase was not truly over. Montevideo, with its calm beaches and slow rhythm, became the backdrop for this long chapter of his life. Imagine him sitting on a terrace as the sun set over the Rio de la Plata, the sky glowing orange and purple, a breeze moving gently through the air. To anyone watching, he might have looked like a man at peace, enjoying a life of quiet success. But inside, he was always calculating, always ready for the moment when the quiet would shatter. And eventually, it did. After more than 20 years of freedom, his name resurfaced in headlines in 2017, when authorities finally discovered who he really was and moved in to arrest him. The man who had been a ghost for so long was suddenly flesh and blood again, and the world was reminded of the story that had never truly ended. But in these years before his capture, Rocco had shown remarkable patience and discipline. His life in Uruguay was not one of recklessness but of careful, deliberate survival. He had managed to balance normalcy with secrecy, fatherhood with fugitivity, and in doing so, he extended his freedom for decades beyond what anyone had imagined possible. It was a testament to his intelligence, his instinct, and his ability to live in the spaces between worlds, not fully a part of the legitimate society around him, but not entirely consumed by the underworld he had left behind. Rocco's years in Montevideo were not simply years of hiding. They were years of performance, a careful, unbroken performance that required him to live two lives at once. By day, he played the role of a quiet, respectable man with a family, a home, and a place in the community. By night, and in the silence of his thoughts, he remained the fugitive, the strategist, the man always calculating what to do if the past came knocking. Living under a false name was both liberation and burden. On one hand, it gave him a clean slate, a way to exist in a place where no one judged him for who he had been. On the other, it meant living with constant vigilance. Every document he signed, every transaction he made, had to match the persona he had built. There could be no slip-ups. Even the smallest inconsistency, a forged ID that didn't match a tax record, a story that contradicted an earlier one, could unravel everything. And yet, to those who met him, Rocco seemed perfectly ordinary. He attended dinner parties, chatted casually with neighbors, and walked through public spaces with the calm of a man who appeared to have nothing to hide. This was part of his genius. He understood that the best place to hide was often in plain sight. If he had stayed reclusive, avoiding everyone, he might have drawn suspicion. But by living as a model citizen, he disarmed curiosity. There was an almost cinematic contrast between the two sides of his existence. In the morning, he might walk his daughter to school, exchanging polite greetings with other parents, standing in the sunshine like any other father. But later that same day, he might be on a secure line, discussing the movement of hundreds of kilograms of cocaine from Brazil to Europe, his voice calm and precise as he coordinated logistics. This duality came at a price. Even if he appeared relaxed, the psychological toll of living as a fugitive was heavy. Imagine lying in bed at night, listening to the distant sounds of the city, wondering if tomorrow would be the day someone recognized you. The mind becomes trained to hear things others do not, the sound of unfamiliar footsteps, the change in tone when a stranger asks a question. Rocco's life became a constant balancing act. Too much visibility could draw attention, too little could raise questions. He had to manage friendships carefully, never allowing anyone to get close enough to discover the truth, yet never distant enough to seem suspicious. This tightrope walk required discipline, and discipline had always been one of his greatest strengths. For years, he succeeded. Montevideo became his stage, and his false identity his most important disguise. Reports say he lived in a high-end neighborhood, drove good cars, and dressed elegantly. He was seen at exclusive social events, sometimes even photographed in group settings, a man who blended so well that even standing in the open, he was invisible. But invisibility does not mean peace. Inside, Rocco must have carried the weight of knowing that his life could shatter at any moment. A random police check, a neighbor with a good memory, a stray word spoken by someone from his past, any of these could unravel decades of careful work. And so, even as he built a new life, he must have lived with the quiet hum of tension, a background noise that never fully stopped. There is also the question of whether he missed Milan, the energy of the city, the thrill of being at the center of a vast operation. Uruguay offered safety but not the same sense of power. The criminal world had changed during his years in hiding, and younger figures were now running the operations he had once overseen. Did he feel nostalgia? Regret? Or was he content to have traded power for survival? Perhaps he found solace in the small routines of normal life, morning coffee on the terrace, family dinners, evenings spent in quiet conversation. These simple things might have been luxuries he could not afford when he was the cocaine king of Milan, constantly on the move, constantly guarding against betrayal. And yet, he never fully stepped away from the game. Law enforcement later claimed that even during his time in Montevideo, Rocco remained involved in high-level cocaine trafficking, using encrypted communications and trusted lieutenants to keep his hand in the business. It is a testament to his ability to compartmentalize, to be both the man smiling at a neighbor over the garden wall and the man orchestrating the flow of narcotics across continents. The double life became his reality, and he played the part flawlessly. So flawlessly, in fact, that for over 20 years, no one connected the quiet man in Montevideo to the fugitive who had eluded Italian justice. It was as though two men existed, one a ghost from the past, the other a polite resident of a South American capital. But no performance lasts forever. As the years passed, technology improved, international cooperation between police forces became stronger, and the net that had once failed to catch him began to tighten again. Investigators never stopped searching, and eventually, they would find the thread that led them to his quiet life. For now, though, Rocco remained free, living in a delicate equilibrium. His double life was both his shield and his prison, a construction so carefully built that it kept him safe but also kept him constantly alert. The man who once stood in the bright lights of Milan's underworld now walked a narrower, quieter path, but one that still held the shadow of risk. This period of his life is perhaps the most human chapter in his story, a time when he was neither the powerful broker nor the captured prisoner, but a man suspended between two worlds, trying to hold them both together. It was a fragile balance, and one day, inevitably, it would break. The morning of September 4, 2017, began like any other in Montevideo. The air was cool, the streets quiet, and the city moved at its usual unhurried pace. For more than 2 decades, Rocco Morabito had managed to live in this rhythm, hidden in plain sight, his life a careful balancing act between blending in and staying invisible. But this day would be different. On this day, the life he had built under a false name would come crashing down. For years, Italian authorities had never stopped looking for him. His file remained active, updated with every new lead, every fragment of information that hinted at his continued existence. International cooperation between law enforcement agencies had improved since the 1990s, and Interpol had never removed his name from their most wanted list. Somewhere, someone was always asking, "Where is Rocco Morabito?" And eventually, someone found an answer. The breakthrough came quietly. Authorities in Uruguay, working with Italian investigators, began to piece together suspicious activity around a man living in a wealthy Montevideo neighborhood. He had expensive tastes, threw lavish parties, and was known to be charming and intelligent. Yet, his background was vague, and something about him did not fit. Bit by bit, they began to suspect that this was not just a well-to-do foreign resident, but someone much more significant. When investigators confirmed his identity, they moved carefully. This was no ordinary arrest, this was the capture of a man who had eluded them for 23 years. The operation had to be precise, silent, and impossible for him to slip through. The arrest itself took place in a hotel in the city of Salto, about 500 kilometers from Montevideo. Rocco had gone there with his daughter, reportedly to arrange her enrollment in a local school. It was a mundane errand, the kind of ordinary act that had helped him blend into society for so long. But this time, the ordinary became extraordinary. Imagine the scene, Rocco sitting in the hotel lobby, perhaps sipping a coffee, unaware that a team of law enforcement officers was already surrounding the building. The lobby is quiet, the air-conditioned hum the only sound. Then, in a moment that must have seemed surreal, police officers approached and asked him to stand. There was no shootout, no chase through the streets, just the quiet end to decades of freedom. When they took him into custody, the news spread rapidly. The cocaine king of Milan had been caught. After more than 2 decades as a fugitive, the man who had once been the most wanted drug trafficker in Italy was finally in handcuffs. The police searched his Montevideo home and found evidence that confirmed just how comfortable his life had been. There were luxury cars, expensive clothing, and photographs of Rocco smiling at parties, surrounded by friends. The double life was exposed. The polite, friendly neighbor was in fact one of the most sought-after fugitives in the world. For Rocco, this moment must have felt both shocking and strangely inevitable. He had known that this day might come, had lived with the knowledge every single day, and yet the reality of capture after so many years of freedom must have landed like a stone in his chest. The arrest made headlines around the globe. Italian prosecutors expressed satisfaction that one of their longest-running cases had finally come to an end. Morabito's capture is one of the most important results in recent years, they said, calling it a major victory in the fight against the Ndrangheta. In Montevideo, neighbors were stunned. To them, Rocco had been a model resident, quiet, polite, almost elegant. Some said they had never suspected a thing. Others admitted that his wealth had always seemed a little mysterious, but they never imagined the man next door was an international fugitive. As for Rocco himself, he reportedly remained calm during his arrest and the days that followed. Those who saw him in custody described him as composed, even dignified, as if he had accepted his fate. Perhaps there was relief in no longer running, in no longer living with the constant hum of fear that had accompanied him for decades. Or perhaps he was already thinking ahead, considering his next move, his next escape. Because even though the arrest was a triumph for law enforcement, it was not yet the end of the story. Rocco was taken to a prison in Montevideo, where he would await extradition to Italy. The process would take time, legal appeals, paperwork, hearings. And in that time, Rocco would begin to plan again. Still, in that moment, as the world read the headlines, it felt like closure. The ghost had been caught. The man who had vanished in 1994 was now back in the hands of justice. For investigators who had worked on the case for years, it was a vindication of patience and persistence. For Rocco, it was a reminder that no man, no matter how clever, can stay ahead of fate forever. Picture him that night, sitting in a cell for the first time in decades. The walls are bare, the bed is simple, the door locked. Outside, Montevideo continues its quiet rhythm, the city lights glowing in the distance. Rocco is alone with his thoughts, thinking of the life he built, the people he left behind, the empire that rose and fell under his watch. And somewhere, deep inside, the question forms, is this truly the end, or is there still one move left to play? That question would be answered 2 years later, in a way no one expected. But for now, in the quiet of the Uruguayan night, Rocco Morabito, the man who had escaped justice for so long, was finally captured. Prison life is a strange adjustment for a man like Rocco Morabito. For over 20 years, he had lived by his own rules, choosing where to go, whom to meet, and how to disappear when danger approached. Now, for the first time in decades, he woke each morning to the sound of iron doors clanging open and guards making their rounds. The Montevideo prison where he was held was not the harshest in the world, but it was still a prison, grey walls, narrow corridors, a daily routine as strict as clockwork. Rocco settled into this routine with the calm of someone who understood that panic was useless. Those who saw him during these months described him as collected, soft-spoken, and almost serene. He greeted guards politely, rarely raised his voice, and kept mostly to himself. To the other inmates, he was both a curiosity and a figure of respect, the man who had once been the cocaine king of Milan, now quietly eating prison meals alongside them. Each day followed the same rhythm. Wake up. Count. Breakfast. Limited yard time. Long hours in the cell. The stillness must have felt strange after so many years of careful movement and constant vigilance. For a man used to making deals and running networks, the slowness of prison time could feel like a kind of psychological torture. And yet, prison gave Rocco something he hadn't had in decades: space to think. No more late-night phone calls, no meetings to arrange, no shipments to monitor. Just time. Time to reflect on the choices that had led him here, time to think about the family he had raised in secret, time to wonder whether this was how it would all end, not with a dramatic showdown, but in a quiet cell, waiting for extradition to Italy. Outside the walls, the legal process moved forward slowly. Extradition cases are rarely quick, and Rocco had a skilled legal team working on his behalf. His lawyers filed appeals, contested procedures, and tried to delay the inevitable. Each hearing gave him hope that perhaps he could extend his stay in Uruguay, or even avoid extradition altogether. But deep down, he must have known that the outcome was only a matter of time. In those months, Rocco wrote letters to his family. Reports say he was deeply concerned about his daughter, who had been with him when he was arrested. He wanted to shield her from the media frenzy, to protect her from the shadow of his name. The letters were calm, reflective, sometimes even philosophical, the words of a man who had been forced into stillness and was trying to make sense of it. Prison also offered Rocco a new vantage point from which to observe people. He watched guards come and go, watched how they moved, how they locked and unlocked doors, how the routines never changed. He watched the other inmates, learning which ones could be trusted, which ones could be useful. Even behind bars, his mind was working, not just reflecting, but planning. Because Rocco had never been a man to accept defeat quietly. He had evaded capture once before, slipping through the fingers of the Italian state in 1994, and that same instinct now began to stir within him. If there was a way out, he would find it. Prison life gave him time to study the rhythms of the place, when the guards were most alert, when they were distracted, when the night fell into its deepest quiet. He spoke little, but he listened much. Slowly, he began to form alliances with a small group of inmates, men who, like him, had no intention of spending the rest of their lives behind bars. The longer he waited, the clearer it became that extradition was only months away. The thought of being flown back to Italy, placed in a high-security prison, and paraded before the media must have been unbearable. In Uruguay, at least, he still had some control, lawyers, visitors, options. In Italy, all of that would vanish. And so the quiet patience turned into quiet determination. If he was going to act, it had to be soon. Every day that passed meant tighter security, more scrutiny, and fewer chances. From the outside, Rocco seemed calm, a model inmate, waiting for the legal process to take its course. But inside, the storm was gathering. The man who had once disappeared from Milan without a trace was preparing himself to do it again, this time under far more difficult circumstances. Imagine him lying on his prison bunk at night, staring at the ceiling, mapping out the escape in his mind over and over. Every corridor, every door, every guard shift, all memorized. The plan would need to be flawless. One mistake would mean failure, and failure in a place like this could cost him the rest of his life. Yet if anyone could do it, it was Rocco. He had already proven once that he could vanish when the world was watching. Now, he would have to prove it again, this time from behind walls designed to keep men like him exactly where they were. For now, though, the night was still, and the cell door remained locked. The city beyond the prison walls went about its business, unaware that behind those bars, one of the most extraordinary escapes in recent history was quietly being planned. The night of June 23, 2019, began like any other in the Montevideo prison, with lights dimmed, doors locked, and the facility settling into its usual rhythm of quiet. Guards made their rounds, inmates spoke in hushed tones, and the building seemed to exhale as it slipped into its nocturnal routine. But on this night, in one of the cells, a plan that had been months in the making was about to unfold, a plan that would once again turn Rocco Morabito into a ghost. Rocco had spent nearly 2 years inside these walls, and in that time he had studied everything, the routines of the guards, the timing of the shifts, the weaknesses of the prison's infrastructure. Alongside 3 other inmates, he had devised a scheme that was bold, dangerous, and almost unthinkable. They would escape not by digging tunnels or bribing their way out, but by climbing to the roof and slipping into the night. The plan required absolute precision. It began in silence, with the men working quickly to breach the space above their cell. They had found a way into the ceiling, perhaps through a vent, perhaps through a weak section of plaster, and now, in the darkness, they moved like shadows. Each sound had to be controlled, a single loud noise could bring guards running. Above them, the roof awaited, a sloped surface overlooking the prison courtyard and the city beyond. The climb was dangerous, but there was no turning back. One by one, they squeezed through the opening and emerged onto the rooftop, the cool night air hitting their faces. For the first time in years, Rocco could see the stars without bars between him and the sky. Below, the prison slept. The guards were somewhere on their rounds, unaware that one of the most important prisoners in the country was no longer where he was supposed to be. Every second mattered now. The group moved quickly across the roof, finding their way to the side of the building where they could descend. Some reports suggest they used a rope, others believe they climbed down carefully, using pipes and ledges. However they did it, they made it to the ground without being seen. Waiting nearby was a vehicle, likely arranged in advance by outside accomplices. The men climbed in, and within minutes they were gone, melting into the streets of Montevideo. By the time the guards discovered the breach, hours had passed. When they opened the cell the next morning, they found nothing but emptiness, the bed neatly made, the room silent, as if the men had evaporated. The escape sent shockwaves through Uruguay and beyond. How could a man as high-profile as Rocco Morabito slip out of a prison so easily? The facility was supposed to be secure, and yet he and his companions had vanished into the night with barely a trace. The news broke quickly, first in local media and then internationally. Once again, Rocco's name was on every headline: Cocaine King escapes prison. For Italian prosecutors, it was a bitter moment. After waiting more than 20 years to bring him home, after winning the extradition order that would have finally placed him on Italian soil, Rocco had escaped yet again. It was as though history had repeated itself. The man they had chased for decades was once again out of reach. For Rocco, the feeling must have been electrifying. To go from the confines of a prison cell to freedom in a single night is to experience the full spectrum of human emotion. There must have been fear, adrenaline, and perhaps even a grim smile as he realized that he had done it again, fooled the system, beaten the odds, reclaimed his freedom. But freedom came with new challenges. Uruguay was now dangerous for him, his face was everywhere, his name known to every police officer in the country. He had to move quickly, to change appearance, to disappear before checkpoints and roadblocks tightened. He may have gone into rural areas, hiding in safe houses, waiting for the initial frenzy to die down before making his next move. The world watched with fascination. The story seemed almost cinematic. A man who had already evaded capture for decades had now staged a Hollywood-worthy escape. People speculated about where he might go next: Brazil? Argentina? Deep into the interior of South America, where law enforcement might not reach? For months, there was no answer. Interpol issued new red notices, and authorities across the continent searched for him, but Rocco had once again vanished. His ability to stay hidden became part of his legend, reinforcing the image of a man who could slip through any net. The rooftop escape also raised uncomfortable questions for prison officials and the Uruguayan government. How had such a high-value prisoner managed to coordinate an escape under their watch? Was there inside help? Were security protocols too weak? An investigation was launched, but whatever answers they found, they came too late. Rocco was gone, and the damage to their credibility was already done. Imagine the prison guards the morning after, standing in the cell, staring at the empty space. The sun rising over the courtyard, the alarm spreading through the building, the realization dawning that one of the most famous fugitives in the world had just humiliated them. For listeners, this is one of the most gripping points in the story, the moment when Rocco's myth grows even larger. He is no longer just a drug broker, no longer just a fugitive, he is an escape artist, a man who refuses to be contained. But every escape leaves a trace, and every trace gives investigators one more chance to catch up. This freedom would not last forever. Somewhere, law enforcement agencies were already recalibrating, already tightening their search, determined that this time, there would be no third act of disappearance. For now, though, Rocco was free again, the night sky above him, the open road ahead. Whatever came next, he had bought himself another chapter in a life already filled with improbable turns. When the news of Rocco Morabito's escape broke, it spread like wildfire. Headlines in Uruguay, Italy, and across the world carried the story: the cocaine king of Milan had slipped through the fingers of justice once again. This was no ordinary fugitive, this was a man who had already vanished for more than 2 decades before finally being captured. Now he had done it again, this time from a high-security prison. The embarrassment for authorities was immense, and the reaction was immediate, a manhunt unlike anything Uruguay had seen in years. Within hours, roadblocks were set up around Montevideo and along the country's highways. Police searched cars, questioned travelers, and knocked on doors in nearby towns. Helicopters scanned the surrounding areas, and officers combed fields and abandoned buildings. But there was no sign of Rocco or the 3 men who had escaped with him. It was as if the night had swallowed them whole. Interpol quickly issued a renewed red notice, urging countries across South America to be on alert. His photograph, a calm, dark-eyed man with neatly groomed hair, was circulated once again, reminding the world that this was not just any prisoner but one of Europe's most wanted men. For investigators in Italy, the escape was devastating. They had been days or weeks away from finally bringing him home to face trial, and now the manhunt had begun all over again. Rumors started to swirl almost immediately. Some said Rocco had crossed into Brazil within 24 hours, using back roads and local contacts to slip past border patrols. Others speculated that he had gone west into Argentina, hiding in remote rural areas where few would think to look. There were even whispers that he might have secured passage on a boat, disappearing across the Atlantic and heading toward Africa or Europe to start a new life under yet another identity. The legend of Rocco Morabito only grew with each passing day. Newspapers called him the Phantom, the man who could not be kept, the Houdini of the Ndrangheta. Television reports replayed the details of his first escape in 1994, framing this new vanishing act as proof that he was a master of evasion. Social media lit up with speculation, some treating him as a folk hero, others as a symbol of the failures of the justice system. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, law enforcement agencies across South America worked together to track any possible lead. They raided safe houses, interrogated known associates, and monitored communications. But Rocco had always been careful, and those who might have known his whereabouts kept silent. If he was in hiding, he was staying far from phones, banks, and anything else that could betray his location. Imagine him during those first days of freedom, moving through the countryside or lying low in a safe house. He would have cut his hair, perhaps changed his appearance, and avoided cities. Every step would have been calculated, when to move, when to stay put, whom to trust. The adrenaline of the escape would have given way to the discipline of survival. Weeks turned into months, and still there was no capture. Interpol and Italian authorities renewed their appeals for information, offering rewards for tips that could lead to his arrest. Every time a major cocaine shipment was intercepted in Europe, investigators wondered if Rocco still had a hand in the trade, still pulling strings from wherever he was hiding. There were sightings, or at least, there were claims of sightings. A man who looked like Rocco was spotted in northern Brazil. Another sighting placed him in Paraguay, moving through border towns where authorities had little control. Each report sent investigators rushing, but each one turned up nothing concrete. Rocco seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, a shadow slipping between countries, always one step ahead. The Uruguayan government, under pressure from Italy and the international community, promised reforms to its prison system, vowing that such an escape would never happen again. But the damage was done. Rocco's name had become a symbol of their failure, a reminder that even their most secure facilities had been breached by a man who simply refused to stay put. For Rocco, this was both triumph and burden. He had his freedom, but he also had the weight of being the most wanted man on the continent. Every police checkpoint, every news report, every stranger's glance carried risk. To stay free, he had to become almost invisible, moving rarely, trusting only a handful of people, living in the spaces where no one looked too closely. At night, perhaps in some small hideout, he must have sat by a window, listening to the sounds of the street outside, wondering how long this new freedom would last. The memory of the prison roof, the moment he saw the stars again, must have stayed with him, a reminder of why he could never let himself be taken alive without a fight. But time is both an ally and an enemy. The longer he stayed free, the more the world forgot to look for him, but the greater the chance that one small mistake, one careless move, would betray him. Rocco had outwitted the law twice, but the hunt was relentless, and the net was growing tighter. Law enforcement agencies across Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay began sharing intelligence more closely than ever before. Special units focused exclusively on tracking down high-value fugitives like Rocco. Slowly, patiently, they began piecing together fragments, reports of a foreign man in João Pessoa, financial movements that didn't fit, phone data that hinted at his presence. The manhunt was entering its final chapter, though no one knew it yet. For now, Rocco remained a free man, still able to breathe the open air, still able to choose where to go next. But the hunters were closing in, and somewhere, perhaps deep inside, he must have sensed that the game could not go on forever. For nearly 2 years after his daring rooftop escape, Rocco Morabito lived once more in the shadows, his name a constant headline, his face posted on Interpol's red notices. The manhunt stretched across borders, with investigators in Italy, Uruguay, Brazil, and beyond coordinating their efforts. Each day of freedom was a victory for Rocco, but it was also another day of risk. He knew that every move he made could bring him closer to discovery, and yet he continued to move, to breathe, to live as a free man while the world hunted for him. Then came May 2021. By now, Rocco had found refuge in Brazil, one of the largest countries in South America, a place where anonymity was possible but never guaranteed. Brazil had vast territories, countless cities, and border regions where fugitives could blend in, but it also had a robust federal police force with a reputation for persistence. For months, investigators had been gathering intelligence, following whispers, and slowly closing in on the man who had embarrassed 2 countries and escaped justice twice. The breakthrough came in the coastal city of João Pessoa, a place known for its beaches, colonial architecture, and warm Atlantic breezes. Somewhere in this seemingly peaceful setting, Rocco had been hiding, living quietly, once again under a false identity. His routine must have been as careful as ever, limited outings, discreet contacts, and an existence built around caution. But one detail, perhaps a phone call, perhaps a financial transaction, perhaps a tip from someone who recognized him, gave investigators the thread they needed to pull. In May, Brazilian federal police, working with Italian authorities, launched an operation that would finally bring the decades-long chase to an end. They did not move hastily. They watched, confirmed, and waited until they were absolutely certain that they had their man. And then, in a quiet, controlled action, they struck. There was no shootout, no rooftop chase this time. The arrest was calm, almost anticlimactic compared to the drama of his escapes. Reports say that Rocco was taken into custody without resistance, his expression composed, as though he had expected this moment. Perhaps he had. After so many years of running, after so many close calls, perhaps he knew that the odds could not favor him forever. Imagine the scene, the warm coastal air, the sound of waves not far away, the sudden appearance of officers moving in with precision. Rocco, standing still, no sudden movements, no desperate attempt to flee, just the quiet acknowledgement that the game of hide-and-seek had finally reached its conclusion. News of the arrest broke quickly. Italy's Ministry of the Interior confirmed the capture with a sense of triumph. Rocco Morabito has been arrested, they announced, calling it a major success in the fight against organized crime. The headlines were global once more, just as they had been in 2017, but this time there was a sense of finality. This was not just another chapter in his story, this was, in many ways, the closing act. In Italy, prosecutors expressed satisfaction. For them, this was the culmination of decades of work, of patient investigations, of near misses and disappointments. The man who had once slipped through their fingers had been caught, and this time, they were determined not to let him go. In Brazil, the arrest was seen as a victory for the federal police, proof that even the most elusive fugitives could be tracked down with enough time and coordination. And in Uruguay, where the memory of his 2019 escape still stung, there was perhaps a measure of relief, that justice might finally be served elsewhere. For Rocco, the moment must have been bittersweet. Freedom had been his greatest prize, the thing he had risked everything to keep, and now it was gone. Once more, he was placed in a cell, this time in a Brazilian prison, under heavy guard. The walls closed in, the bars locked, and the routine began again, counts, meals, the long, quiet hours of waiting. But there was a difference now. This time, the extradition process moved swiftly. Italy was ready, and Brazil was cooperative. The paperwork was processed, the flights arranged, the legal obstacles cleared away. The world would not wait decades again. And so, after more than a quarter century of running, hiding, and escaping, Rocco Morabito was finally on a plane bound for Italy. It was a moment of symbolic weight, the boy from Africa, the broker of Milan, the ghost of Montevideo, the escapee of Montevideo's prison, now returning to the country where it had all begun. The flight must have been a quiet one. Perhaps he looked out the window at the clouds below, reflecting on the long road that had led him here. So many years, so many disguises, so many moments when he had been just one step ahead. And now, here he was, strapped into a seat, guarded, the future no longer in his hands. When the plane touched down in Italy, the waiting officers escorted him off, cameras capturing the moment. The man who had evaded justice for so long was finally back on Italian soil. For the public, the story seemed almost mythical, the end of a long pursuit, the closing of a circle that had begun decades earlier. But for Rocco, it was simply the next phase. There would be trials, verdicts, and sentences. There would be media coverage and endless speculation about whether he still held secrets about the inner workings of the Ndrangheta. And yet, in the quiet of that moment, there must have been a strange calm. The running was over. The chase that had defined so much of his life had reached its inevitable conclusion. Whatever came next, he would face it not as a ghost, but as a man. The day of extradition arrived under heavy security. Rocco Morabito was escorted from the Brazilian prison in which he had spent the last months, flanked by armed federal police officers who had no intention of letting history repeat itself. This time, there would be no rooftop escape, no last-minute vanishing act. The convoy moved with precision, armored vehicles cutting through traffic as they made their way to the airport. Cameras captured the scene, Rocco stepping out, hands cuffed, his face calm, his gaze steady, as though resigned to what was coming. For Italy, this was a moment of triumph nearly 30 years in the making. The man who had embarrassed law enforcement with his 1994 disappearance, who had built a new life abroad, who had climbed out of a Uruguayan prison roof and vanished once again, was finally coming home to face justice. Officials in Rome spoke publicly of the importance of the case, calling Rocco's return a major blow to the Ndrangheta and a symbol of the state's unyielding pursuit of organized crime figures. The flight from Brazil to Italy was conducted under maximum security. Rocco was watched at every moment, accompanied by Italian agents who had waited years for this task. The atmosphere must have been heavy with unspoken tension, the weight of history sitting in the cabin, the memory of decades of pursuit hanging in the air. Perhaps Rocco sat quietly, his mind turning over the years that had passed since he last saw the Italian coastline. The last time he was in his homeland, he was a rising power in Milan's underworld. Now, he was returning as a captured man. When the plane finally descended into Rome's airport, the scene was charged with symbolism. On the tarmac, police vehicles waited. Officers in uniform stood ready. As Rocco stepped off the plane, cameras clicked, capturing the moment for news broadcasts that would beam across the country that night. The images showed a man who was no longer the untouchable broker of Milan, no longer the phantom who had vanished into the world. He was back, flesh and blood, in the custody of the state he had eluded for so long. The media storm was immediate. Italian newspapers ran bold headlines, "Rocco Morabito back in Italy." Television commentators revisited the story of his life, recounting the rise of the cocaine king, his years of fugitivity, and his two dramatic escapes. For the public, it was as if a ghost story had suddenly become real. The man whose name had become legend was now in a cell where they could see him, where the cameras could photograph him through narrow bars. In the days that followed, Rocco was transferred to a high-security prison, the kind designed for top members of the mafia. The conditions were far stricter than anything he had known in Montevideo. The guards were vigilant, the routines unforgiving, and the possibility of escape virtually non-existent. Here, in these stark surroundings, Rocco awaited trial. Court preparations began almost immediately. Prosecutors dusted off files that had been growing thicker since the 1990s, updating them with new intelligence and witness testimonies gathered over the years. The charges against him were serious: international drug trafficking, association with a criminal organization, and conspiracy. Decades may have passed, but the Italian justice system had not forgotten. For Rocco, this was the moment of reckoning. The trial would not just decide his fate, it would shape how his life would be remembered. He appeared in court under heavy guard, dressed simply, his hair slightly grayer than in the old photographs, but his posture straight. Those present in the courtroom described him as calm, attentive, even polite when addressed by the judges. He spoke softly, answering questions with measured words. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, their cameras and microphones ready. The public wanted to see the man whose story had captured imaginations for so long. Was he remorseful? Defiant? Resigned? In every image, Rocco looked composed, a man who had lived long enough with danger to know that showing fear served no purpose. The extradition and trial carried a deeper meaning for Italy. The state had faced decades of challenge from the Ndrangheta, an organization that had grown to become one of the most powerful criminal syndicates in the world. To bring Rocco back, to place him in front of a judge, was a symbolic victory, proof that no one, not even someone who had escaped twice, could stay beyond the reach of justice forever. For the families of those harmed by the drug trade, Rocco's presence in court was a reminder of the devastation wrought by cocaine on countless lives. For law enforcement, it was vindication, the closing of a case that had haunted them for years. And for Rocco himself, it was a final confrontation with the country he had fled, the life he had once ruled, and the choices that had brought him to this moment. As the hearings progressed, the weight of time hung over everything. This was no longer the 1990s. Many of Rocco's contemporaries were gone, either killed in vendettas or locked away for life. The criminal world had changed, and the empire he once helped build had been reshaped by others. He was a relic of a different era, now standing trial in a world that had moved on without him. Yet, there was still a fascination with him, an almost cinematic quality to his story that kept the public watching. Each update from the courtroom was reported widely, each image of Rocco in the dock examined for signs of emotion. Was this the end of the legend, or simply another chapter in a life that had defied easy conclusions? For now, the cameras clicked, the gavel struck, and the process moved forward. Rocco Morabito was finally where the law had always wanted him to be, back in Italy, facing justice, with no rooftop to climb, no night to vanish into. To truly understand Rocco Morabito's story, one must understand the world that shaped him, the shadowy, secretive, and remarkably resilient organization known as the Ndrangheta. This was not just the backdrop of his life, it was the framework within which he rose to power, the network that enabled his empire, and the force that gave meaning to both his triumphs and his eventual downfall. The Ndrangheta is unlike any other criminal organization in the world. Born in Calabria, one of Italy's poorest and most isolated regions, it is an organization built on blood ties, secrecy, and tradition. For generations, it operated in the rugged villages of southern Italy, where law enforcement was weak and family loyalty was everything. Unlike the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, which has long captured the public imagination with its flamboyant dons and bloody wars, the Ndrangheta preferred silence. Its members did not seek the spotlight. They did not boast. They thrived in the shadows. This secrecy proved to be its greatest strength. Law enforcement struggled for decades to infiltrate the organization, because to do so meant breaking through bonds of blood and kinship. Membership in the Ndrangheta is passed down like an inheritance, often from father to son, uncle to nephew. A man is not simply recruited, he is initiated, sworn to secrecy in ancient ceremonies that date back generations. These rituals, often held in rural chapels or remote countryside, are designed to bind the initiate to the organization for life, making betrayal nearly unthinkable. By the 1980s and 1990s, when Rocco was rising in Milan, the Ndrangheta had already begun transforming itself from a regional force into a global powerhouse. They moved beyond extortion and kidnapping, the crimes that had sustained them for decades, and took control of one of the most lucrative markets on earth, cocaine. While other Italian mafias fought bloody wars, the Ndrangheta built quiet, efficient supply chains that connected Calabria to Colombia, Brazil, and beyond. The organization's genius was in logistics. They did not simply buy cocaine from cartels, they created partnerships, ensuring that they controlled the entire pipeline from production to distribution. Through ports in Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands, they funneled tons of cocaine into Europe each year, generating billions of euros in profit. These profits were laundered through legitimate businesses, construction companies, restaurants, hotels, even renewable energy projects, until the money was nearly impossible to trace. Rocco's role in this world was that of a broker, a man who could bridge the gap between South American suppliers and European distributors. He was not a foot soldier or a violent enforcer. He was a connector, a negotiator, a strategist who understood both the language of business and the language of the underworld. In many ways, he represented the modern face of the Ndrangheta, educated, cosmopolitan, comfortable moving in elite circles, yet deeply rooted in the codes of loyalty and silence that defined the organization. The reach of the Ndrangheta is staggering. Today, investigators believe it operates in more than 40 countries, with cells in Europe, North and South America, Africa, and Australia. They have been found in places as far apart as Toronto, Melbourne, and Stuttgart, quietly embedding themselves in local economies, investing in businesses, and building influence. Their power lies in their ability to remain invisible. Unlike other mafias that occasionally seek to intimidate with displays of violence, the Ndrangheta prefers to be underestimated. This global reach made men like Rocco invaluable. He was part of the network that kept the cocaine highway running smoothly, ensuring that shipments were coordinated, payments collected, and alliances maintained. He was a node in a system so vast that taking down one man, even one as significant as Rocco, could never dismantle it entirely. And this is what makes his story so fascinating. Rocco was both extraordinary and ordinary within the context of the Ndrangheta. Extraordinary in the sense that his escapes and long fugitive life turned him into a near-mythical figure. Ordinary in the sense that there are other men like him, other brokers, other negotiators, who continue to move within the shadows, keeping the system alive. Italian prosecutors often refer to the Ndrangheta as a state within a state. It has its own hierarchy, its own rules, its own way of resolving disputes. It punishes betrayal with death, rewards loyalty with protection, and expects its members to place the organization above everything, even family. To grow up in a place like Africa, as Rocco did, was to breathe this reality. It was not just crime, it was culture, tradition, and a way of survival. This context helps explain Rocco's choices. To an outsider, his life may look like a series of bold decisions: to join the drug trade, to rise in Milan, to escape and reinvent himself. But to someone raised in the world of the Ndrangheta, those choices may have felt inevitable. The path was already laid out, and Rocco simply walked it with more intelligence and daring than most. Even now, with Rocco in prison, the Ndrangheta continues to thrive. International operations seize record amounts of cocaine each year, and yet the flow never stops. Law enforcement has made significant gains, arresting bosses and dismantling cells, but the organization's decentralized structure allows it to regenerate quickly. In many ways, Rocco's story is less about the rise and fall of a single man and more about the endurance of a system that has proven almost impossible to eradicate. And yet, stories like his serve an important purpose. They shine a light on a world that prefers to stay hidden. They remind us that behind every headline about a drug seizure or a trial, there are human lives, families, communities, and, yes, criminals, caught up in a network of power that stretches across continents. As we step back from Rocco's personal journey, we see him as part of something much larger. He was a product of the Ndrangheta, shaped by its codes, empowered by its network, and ultimately brought down because of its relentless pursuit by law enforcement. His life is a window into the mechanics of a global criminal empire, one that continues to operate even as its most famous figures fall. To live as a fugitive is to live in a state of permanent contradiction. You are free, but never truly free. You can walk under the open sky, sit at a cafe table, feel the sun on your face, yet all the while, you know that every step, every glance, every small mistake could bring it all to an end. For Rocco Morabito, this contradiction defined more than half his life. He was a man who spent decades outside the walls of a prison but inside an invisible cage of his own making. Psychologists who study fugitives often speak about the gradual toll this life takes on the mind. The adrenaline that accompanies the first days or weeks of escape, that sharp, electric thrill of having slipped through the fingers of the law, eventually gives way to a quieter, heavier weight. The body may relax, but the mind does not. Rocco must have felt this transition many times over. After his first escape in 1994, he had to rebuild his entire identity, to vanish into the world. After his second escape in 2019, the stakes were even higher, his name and face plastered across every newspaper, every police bulletin, every Interpol notice. Imagine waking every morning and scanning your surroundings before you even stand up, listening for unfamiliar sounds, memorizing exits, calculating how to slip away if something goes wrong. This hyper-awareness becomes second nature, but it also becomes exhausting. It frays the nerves, shortens patience, and makes true rest nearly impossible. And yet, there is another side to this life, a strange exhilaration, a sense of being alive in a way most people never experience. Each day is a test of cunning and luck, each moment a chance to outwit the world. Rocco was no ordinary man, he had survived on instinct and intelligence for years. Perhaps part of him even relished the game, the challenge of staying one step ahead. But games have a cost. Over time, the circle of trust shrinks. Friends can become liabilities. Family can become vulnerabilities. The fewer people who know where you are, the safer you are, but the lonelier you become. Rocco had a daughter whom he clearly loved deeply, and she was part of his life in Uruguay. But even fatherhood had to be managed carefully, so that it would not draw attention. Every school visit, every social event was a risk, a chance that someone might notice too much. Living like this also changes how you see the world. Simple things, a police car passing by, a knock at the door, a stranger looking too long, take on enormous weight. The mind begins to see patterns, to assume danger where there may be none. Paranoia becomes a survival skill, but it can also eat away at peace of mind. Perhaps the most haunting part of a fugitive's life is the knowledge that time is not truly on your side. Each year that passes may make law enforcement forget you a little, but technology improves, cooperation between countries strengthens, and new investigators take up the case with fresh energy. In some ways, Rocco's first escape bought him a kind of mythic status, but it also placed a target on his back that never faded. In the stillness of night, one imagines him lying awake, wondering if he would ever stop running. Did he dream of walking freely through the streets of Milan again, no longer looking over his shoulder? Did he wonder whether there could ever be a place in the world where he could truly be safe? Or did he simply accept that this was his destiny, to be hunted, to stay hidden, to live with one eye on the door forever? There is also the question of guilt, not just for the crimes themselves, but for the lives disrupted by his choices. The cocaine trade is not bloodless, it leaves addiction, violence, and death in its wake. Did Rocco think about that, sitting quietly in Montevideo, sipping wine on his terrace? Or did he see himself as a businessman, a man who simply connected supply and demand, leaving the consequences for others to bear? What we do know is that Rocco was remarkably composed when he was finally captured, both in 2017 and again in 2021. This composure suggests a man who had long contemplated the possibility of being caught and had made peace with it. Perhaps he even felt a kind of strange relief: no more hiding, no more pretending, no more waking in the night to check for shadows. And yet, the second escape shows that a part of him still yearned for freedom at any cost. The decision to climb through the roof of a prison is not made lightly. It is a choice to risk everything, to risk being shot, to risk spending the rest of one's life in even harsher confinement, for the chance to breathe free air again. That decision reveals something essential about Rocco's psychology: freedom was worth more to him than safety, perhaps even more than life itself. Living as a fugitive also forges a particular kind of solitude. There is little room for confession, for vulnerability, for letting one's guard down. Whatever doubts or fears Rocco had, he must have carried them silently. That silence becomes its own prison, even as the body remains free. And now, as he sits in an Italian cell, the running finally over, one wonders what goes through his mind. Is there regret? Is there pride? Or is there simply exhaustion, the kind of deep, bone-level fatigue that comes after decades of being on high alert? This section of the story reminds us that beneath the headlines and the myth, there is a human being, a man who lived half his life in a state of perpetual flight. It is easy to view him as a legend, as the cocaine king who outwitted the law twice. But it is just as important to see him as a person shaped by fear, ambition, and the relentless weight of being hunted. For listeners, this is a moment to pause, to reflect, to imagine the quiet rooms where Rocco once sat alone, thinking of what had been lost and what might still be gained. It is a reminder that even the most notorious fugitives are not just symbols, they are people, carrying heavy burdens, walking a narrow path between freedom and capture until, finally, the path runs out. When history remembers Rocco Morabito, it will likely do so with a mixture of fascination and contradiction. He was not the most violent figure in the history of the Ndrangheta, nor the most openly flamboyant. He did not seek fame, did not court the media, did not posture like some of the bosses whose names became household legends. And yet, his story has traveled further than most, precisely because of the strange mixture of brilliance, defiance, and mystery that defined his life. Today, Rocco is remembered not only as the cocaine king of Milan, but as one of the most notorious fugitives in modern Italian history. His ability to disappear in 1994 stunned investigators and inspired a manhunt that lasted nearly a quarter of a century. When he was finally captured in 2017, it felt like the resolution of a story that had been left hanging for too long, and yet, by escaping in 2019, he turned that resolution into yet another cliffhanger. In doing so, he became something more than just a criminal. He became a symbol, for some, a symbol of defiance against authority, for others, a reminder of how long justice can take. Media portrayals of Rocco often focus on his cunning and his calm, his ability to live as a phantom for decades. Documentaries and investigative articles dissect the details of his life in Montevideo, the elegant house, the neighborhood parties, the double existence that fooled even those closest to him. His story fascinates precisely because it feels cinematic, a man who led two lives, one as a respected member of society, the other as a ghost whose past could not be spoken aloud. Court records, meanwhile, preserve a different picture. They detail the drug shipments, the wiretaps, the financial transactions, the carefully built network that made Rocco such an important figure in the European cocaine trade. They remind us that his story is not just about a clever escape artist, but about the vast amounts of narcotics that flowed into Europe under his watch, and the damage those drugs caused. Within the world of organized crime, Rocco's name carries weight as both an inspiration and a warning. To some, his ability to evade capture for so long is proof of the power of discipline and foresight, a demonstration that intelligence can be as potent as violence in the criminal world. To others, his eventual arrest and extradition are a reminder that no one escapes forever, that every fugitive must one day face the reckoning. In Calabria, his name still evokes mixed feelings. There are those who see him as a brilliant figure who rose from nothing, embodying the ambition and resourcefulness that allowed the Ndrangheta to expand far beyond its rural roots. But there are also those who see his life as a tragedy, a boy from Africa who might have chosen a different path but instead bound himself to a destiny that led to prison cells and international headlines. Perhaps what makes Rocco's legacy so compelling is that it is neither purely heroic nor purely villainous. He was a man who pursued power and freedom with relentless determination, but who also lived with the consequences of those pursuits, isolation, fear, and ultimately capture. His story invites reflection on the nature of ambition, on what it means to run from one's past, and on how far a person will go to remain free. Even now, as he sits in an Italian cell awaiting the final stages of his legal process, his legend continues to grow. Writers, filmmakers, and journalists are drawn to his tale. There is talk of dramatizations, of turning his life into a film or series that captures the tension, the elegance, and the audacity of a man who lived on the edge for so long. In many ways, Rocco Morabito has become a modern myth, a character who embodies the themes of rise and fall, escape and pursuit, cunning and inevitability. His life reminds us of the thin line between freedom and captivity, between power and downfall. But his legacy is also cautionary. For all the years he spent free, for all the cleverness and resourcefulness he displayed, he is now where the law always intended him to be, behind bars. His story ends not in a villa overlooking the sea, but in a prison cell, with the state's grip finally unbroken. And yet, there is something enduring about his legend. The image of Rocco climbing through the roof of a prison and vanishing into the night will remain etched in memory for years to come. It is the image of a man who refused to surrender quietly, who lived by his wits until the very end. For listeners, Rocco's legacy is not simply a story of crime but a meditation on the human spirit, on the lengths to which a person will go to preserve his autonomy, on the price that comes with that choice, and on the strange respect we sometimes feel for those who manage to play the game so well, for so long. The story of Rocco Morabito ends not with the roar of sirens or the blaze of a final shootout, but with quiet. A man who spent decades running, hiding, and outsmarting the law now sits in a cell, his life measured by the rhythm of prison routines. The world outside moves on, the ports of Europe still receive their cargo ships, and the shadow networks of the Ndrangheta continue to operate. Yet Rocco's part in that great machine has been brought to an end. It is tempting to see his story as one of simple rise and fall, a man who climbed from the dusty streets of Africa to become the cocaine king of Milan, only to lose everything. But that would be too simple. Rocco's story is also one of resilience, of a man who refused to surrender, who twice evaded capture and bought himself years of freedom that few others could have claimed. His life can be read as a meditation on ambition. From a boyhood shaped by poverty, he set out to escape the fate of so many in his village. He found a way to seize power, to build wealth, to live a life of elegance and influence. But ambition is a double-edged sword. It gave him everything he dreamed of, and it also led him into a life where peace was forever out of reach. As we look back on his story, we see the contrasts that made him so compelling. The boy from the mountains of Calabria, standing years later in the glittering heart of Milan. The fugitive walking through Montevideo's quiet neighborhoods under a false name, smiling politely at neighbors while knowing that at any moment the past might catch him. The man climbing through the roof of a prison and disappearing into the night, only to be caught again on a quiet street in Brazil. It is a story about freedom, how much we crave it, and what we are willing to risk to keep it. Rocco risked everything, again and again, to remain free. And for decades, he succeeded. Even now, there are those who see his escapes not merely as criminal acts, but as feats of human willpower, proof of his ingenuity and courage under pressure. But his story is also about inevitability. No one can outrun time forever. Sooner or later, the past arrives, patient and unstoppable. The same state he escaped in 1994 finally brought him home nearly 30 years later. In this, Rocco's life becomes a reminder that every choice casts a long shadow, and eventually, we must step into that shadow and face what we have made. Perhaps, in his cell, Rocco thinks of Africa, of the winding roads and olive groves of his youth. Perhaps he remembers the first small crimes, the first deals, the first nights in Milan when he felt the rush of power and possibility. Perhaps he remembers the quiet moments in Montevideo, sitting on a terrace at dusk, wondering how long he could keep the world at bay. There is something almost poetic in the arc of his life, a circle that brought him back to where it all began, back to the country that raised him, back to the system that once tried to catch him and failed. He is no longer a ghost. He is no longer a man running through the night. He is present, accounted for, his name no longer whispered but spoken aloud in courtrooms and headlines. And yet, the legend of Rocco Morabito will live on. People will still tell the story of the man who vanished just before the police came knocking, who built a second life half a world away, who climbed through the roof of a prison and disappeared into the stars. They will speak of his calm under pressure, his ability to stay invisible for so long, his almost mythical skill at surviving where others would have fallen. As the lights dim and the prison falls silent at night, perhaps Rocco lies on his bunk and listens to the quiet, the way he once did in Montevideo, the way he once did in Milan, the way he once did as a boy in Africa. And perhaps there is a strange kind of peace in knowing that the chase is over, that there is no more running to do, no more disguises to wear, no more doors to slip through in the dead of night. For those of us hearing his story, there is a lesson here, about choices, about consequences, about the relentless pull of destiny. It reminds us that freedom is precious, but so is stillness, and that a life spent in pursuit can leave a man weary no matter how clever he is. So let the story end here, in the quiet of a prison cell, with the sound of the world outside fading into the distance. Let us leave Rocco Morabito where he is now, no longer a fugitive, no longer a phantom, but simply a man, living out the final chapters of a life that once seemed larger than life itself. And as we close our eyes and drift towards sleep, we might picture the night sky over Calabria, or Montevideo, or João Pessoa, the same stars shining above all the places where Rocco once stood. Those stars are constant, indifferent to power, wealth, escape, or capture. They remind us that every story, no matter how dramatic, eventually comes to rest under the same sky, in the same stillness, at the end of the road.